Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our audiences around the world. My name is Bonnie McClafferty. I'm the Chief of Party for EatSafe and the Director of Food Safety at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. EatSafe and GAIN are delighted to be hosting this webinar today. It's the first in our new year. Happy New Year to all. This one is titled Meeting Consumers Where They Are, Innovative Approaches to Food Safety. At GAIN, our goal is to improve the consumption of safe, nutritious foods for all people, especially those most vulnerable to malnutrition. From the generous support of USAID's Feed the Future initiative, we've been leading EatSafe, evidence and action towards safe, nutritious food. EatSafe's aim is to enable lasting improvements in the safety of nutritious foods in traditional markets, with a special focus on consumers. Over the course of 2020 and 2021, EatSafe and GAIN have been hosting a series of webinars like this one that have drawn attention to the need to bring food safety forward in the food systems transformation agenda as a key determinant of food and nutrition security. Today's event is our 9th webinar. This one is special for me for two reasons. The first I will share now, the second at the end of the event. Like no other, this webinar will focus on the central driver of EatSafe and our work that we know will contribute to enabling lasting improvement in the safety of nutritious foods in traditional markets, that being consumer demand. For those who are not familiar with the context where EatSafe works, we focus on traditional markets, where a large share of consumers in low and middle income countries purchase their foods, markets that are always colorful, sometimes wet, sometimes dusty, and forever alive with an active community. They also often lack infrastructure that keeps foodborne pathogens at bay, such as access to potable water, adequate sanitation and waste management facilities, food storage or on-site cooling or refrigeration. Traditional markets are where the nutritionally vulnerable often source their food. It is also where few, if any, governing bodies are there to apply safety standards or enforce them. They are made up of vendors and producers who are often not registered, who are rarely monitored by food inspection agencies. As a result, domestic traditional markets serving primarily low-income consumers present food safety concerns that have largely been left unaddressed. Consumers play a pivotal, untapped role in increasing access to safe foods in low and middle income countries, and launching consumer-centered food safety efforts requires understanding human behavior, decision-making, and effective mechanisms that resonate with target market actors, including consumers and vendors. At EatSafe, we ask whether in these contexts, the consumer can ensure the safety of their food by demanding it. This is a critical time to understand consumer-driven demand for food safety in low and middle income countries, and an opportunity to identify and test possible strategies and tools to improve it. With this in mind, we are thrilled to hear from several presenters during today's webinar. In the interest of time, I will end my introduction here and pass the microphone over to Caroline Smith-DeWall, our moderator for today. Caroline joined GAIN in 2020 as the Deputy Director for EatSafe, and before coming to GAIN, she worked for many years on food safety issues, representing consumers at and before the US Congress in an international forum such as the Codex Alimentarius. She also served as International Food Safety Policy Manager in the US government, and we're delighted to have Caroline on the EatSafe team, incredibly fortunate to have her on board to lead this important conversation. But before we dive in, Caroline, I just want to say, I'll share two logistical notes. One is that to ask questions at any time throughout this webinar, please click on the Q&A button in your Zoom console. And today's event will be recorded. After the session, the recording will be accessible on the GAIN website at www.gainhealth.org. Caroline, over to you.
Thank you, Bonnie, for this introduction to EatSafe and to the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. Today, we're going to dive into one of my favorite topics, how to design truly effective food safety programs centered around the consumer. Over the next hour or so, we will take an innovation journey from problem identification through identifying and preparing solutions for implementation in the field. As Bonnie mentioned, EatSafe is tackling a true challenge: how to engage consumers who shop at traditional markets to demand safer foods. Traditional markets are an important source of food for many low-income consumers, but those markets frequently suffer from not only inadequate infrastructure, but a lack of attention and investment from governments. We start our innovation journey with a description of consumer perspectives on the safety of food they eat. Dr. Sarah Cumbers is the Evidence and Insight Director at the Lloyd's Register Foundation, and they conducted the first ever global survey of consumers on day-to-day risks. Sarah's team at Lloyd's uses data and evidence to understand the complex problems that affect safety in order to improve safety outcomes. Sarah has a PhD in immunology and has spent years evaluating approaches to health and healthcare. Please begin, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you for the invitation to participate in the webinar. Today, it's really exciting to be able to talk about the World Risk Poll data to this audience, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So the World Risk Poll, here on this first slide, was undertaken for the first time back in 2019. We interviewed 150,000 people, so face-to-face interviews, face-to-face for the majority of these, in 142 countries across the globe. So we've got a huge data set, which we believe is unique. It gives a voice to millions of citizens who don't have their voice recognised in other ways. Their data is hidden, just doesn't exist. The poll was undertaken by Gallup, and the reason for undertaking the poll was that we were really interested to understand more about the everyday risks that people face in their daily lives, and not just about the experience of risk, but also how they perceive that risk. The data set can then be used, for example, to look at that gap between people's perception of risk and their experience of risk. And we can start to use that data to dig down and design interventions to help communities be safer. And so today I'm going to talk about one of the key takeaways from the poll around food safety, but it is a huge data set. We cover a whole range of different areas, so please do dig in to the detail. You can find it on the Foundation's website. And so the next slide shows the results of the some of the results of the first question that we asked in the poll. What's the greatest source of risk to your safety in your daily life? And you might want to ponder that and think about how you would answer that. Well, we found that 4% of people worldwide, so that's equivalent to 300 million people, said that unsafe food or water were among the two biggest threats to their safety. And you can see here that for some, that perception of risk is particularly high. So you can see here that the dark blue dot there, Malawi, 16% of people in Malawi indicated that food and safety was the biggest source of threat to their safety. And this just highlights the challenges that there are globally with both food and water. And to be able to design interventions to make a difference here, of course, it's really important to have accurate data. But for many developing countries in particular, we know that that data is scarce. And so the presentation today is just going to take you through some of the data that we've got from the World Risk Poll, and just to start to highlight how that data can be used to fill that gap. And so the next slide just pulls out one of the key findings from the poll, that 17% or 1 billion people in the world said that they or somebody they know had experienced serious harm from eating food in the 2 years prior to polling. Now we know from the WHO, for example, their estimates that 600 million people, or about 8% of the global population, fall ill every year from eating unsafe food. And we know that almost 500,000 people die, with young children and the elderly being particularly vulnerable. But the World Risk Poll really is the first time that respondents themselves have had the opportunity to report the harm that they have experienced or that people that they know have experienced. Almost matching that experience of harm from food, 14% said in the poll that they'd experienced harm from drinking water, 9% had experienced harm from both. And so this data set really complements the best existing data that's available at the moment from the WHO's initiative that ran between 2007 and 2015, and provides the first people's voice perspective on estimates of the impact of their experience and perception of the harm from food. And so this next slide digs further into the data, shows the regional data. We didn't just ask respondents in the poll about their experience of harm from food, but we also asked about their perception of harm. And so you can see here in this chart, the worry is in the dark green bars, and then the experience in the lighter shade. And you can see here that respondents in Southern Africa, for example, this highest peak here at 43%. Also Latin America and the Caribbean and Central and Western Africa, also with these high peaks at 33 and 27, they're the most worried about harm from unsafe food. Whereas respondents in Eastern Africa and the Middle East on the left-hand side here, 29% and 27% are the most likely to have experienced harm from unsafe food. But for me, the most interesting thing about this slide is the significant gap that we see between perception and experience of harm in some of the regions. So in most regions, more people are worried about the risk of food than have experienced harm. So you can see that in most regions, these green bars are higher than the light green bars. But the results from Northern Africa, for example, show the gap runs the other way. And you can see here that 16% of the population worried about food, whereas 9% or 25% have experienced harm. And so what this global polling data is showing us is that in some regions of the world, the perspectives of consumers on the risk from food is not aligning with the actual risk that they're facing from food. And so the data suggests that there's an opportunity for action in these regions to highlight the risk of harm from food and to help people be safer. And so I want to step into the data in a bit more granularity now on the next slide, which starts to look from a country perspective. And so this map pulls out the data from the poll on food and water. So the green dots are the top countries experiencing harm from food and the blue from water. And you can see that the majority of these countries, or rather all of these countries, are in the developing world. And so we can see that 52% of people in Liberia, for example, have experienced harm from food, and 51% in Zambia, 45% in Mozambique, the top three there. And again, this is mirroring the WHO data. It's important that we do triangulate with other data that exists, because this data is quite new from the World Risk Poll. And the WHO report, of course, that regions in Africa and also Southeastern Asia are least likely to have implemented minimum requirements for food safety. So on the next slide, I just pulled out these countries, these four countries here, because of course the GAIN programme operates in Mozambique, which I just mentioned, but also across a range of other low and middle income countries. And so this slide here focuses in on some of these countries to show how we can dig into the data by different demographics to gain more insight into perceptions and experience of harm from food. So you can see that for Mozambique here in this left-hand column, the experience and perception of harm from food are well above the global average. And this actually varies little, some variation there, but not much, by age or sex. However, if we look for Ethiopia, where the worrying experience sits just above the global level, you can see here at 33% experience, 31% worry. There's also a clear difference between the sexes, with men experienced from harm here at 38%, women at 29%. And men are also have a lower perception of the risk of harm from food at 29% there. So then in Nigeria, again, the figures are quite close to the global average, but look at the data on experience versus perception of harm in the older population at the bottom here. And you can see that there's a very high burden of experience of harm from food in the 50 to 64 age bracket, up at 30% there, but also a very, very low perception of the risk in the over 65s, down at 9%. And I just included India here because I thought this was really interesting, actually, that you can see very, very little variation here across different demographic groups. And I hope you can start to see how, in using this knowledge, you can help to start building up an understanding that can then be used to then target more specifically food safety interventions. Now, we also asked in the poll about people's trust in sources of food safety information, and that's shown on the next slide. Thank you. And we asked people about the sources of food safety information that they turn to, but also about those sources that they trust the most. And you can see, would you use the source is in green, and would you trust this source the most is in purple. And you can see that the most turned to sources of food safety information globally were family and friends, up at 73% here, food packaging and labels, 69%, and then medical professionals at 68%. And what's really striking in these results is that few people across the world rank official organisations highly when asked about their most trusted source of information. So you can see that 52% would use, but only 15% would trust the most as their #1 source of food safety information. Also interesting here, about half of people in low-income economies sought food safety information from celebrities or from religious leaders. So the global average 26%, but 54% in Eastern Africa as a region where we know that experience of harm from food is very high. So interestingly, people's experience of harm from food didn't impact on trust. So family and friends and medical professionals were the most trusted, regardless of whether an individual had experienced harm from food or not. So a whole host of information there that we've only just started to dig into, but as I say, do access the report, which is on our website for more in-depth findings. And so the final slide just, I think, gives the, gives a hyperlink through to the report. So please do have a look at that. We're very keen that the World Risk Poll data is used to influence action on safety issues. Some examples here of the different actors who might wish to use it: policymakers, the food industry, food safety authorities in a whole range of different ways. The data is freely available. It can be downloaded in Excel format from the Foundation's website, but also on the UK Data Service as well. And we'd love to hear from you if you do use this data and to see what we can do to promote your work. So that's all I wanted to say today, and look forward to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Our next presentation will describe the techniques for learning from stakeholders, the stakeholders that we hope to engage, and how their stories can motivate action. Walker Lambert is the managing producer at Pierce Mill Entertainment and Education, which is an EatSafe partner organization. Pierce Mill works with many different organizations to develop media content that can transform audience expectations, attitudes, and behaviors. Walker, with degrees from both Johns Hopkins University and the University of Chicago, is an acolyte of the power of stories to change lives. Please begin, Walker.
Thank you, Caroline. And again, thank you for the opportunity to speak to everyone today. So I'm going to talk about a different kind of data, a kind of data that we at Pierce Mill Media use a lot, which is the story. And in the case of food safety in traditional markets, for us, local stories are the starting point to meet consumers and vendors where they are. So we employ something that we call story sourcing. Story sourcing is our semi-formal formative research process that uses journalistic techniques to gather stories directly from the target audience. The output of story sourcing are local stories and anecdotes from daily life at home, at work, within the community, the stories of vendors and consumers of traditional markets. In turn, these stories become the inspiration and the foundation for the writing and design of compelling and hopeful, effective social and behavior change media, whatever form that takes, be it a radio program or a web series or a TV show, a poster campaign, PSAs, any kind of media that is aiming to contribute to changing audience expectations and ultimately behavior around food safety. As a method of formative research, story sourcing, I'd say, is a cousin to in-depth interviews, but there are some key differences. So first, with story sourcing, we are primarily looking for stories with a central conflict, theme, or emotion strongly embedded within them. They can, but they don't have to focus on the theme of the project. So in this case, that would be food safety. Really, we are hunting for compelling stories, and as such, they can be standalone in and of themselves. This kind of story you might tell a friend or a spouse. These stories are illustrative of something within the community, but they don't necessarily need to fit into broader narratives about the community, ones that you might extrapolate from more formalized qualitative research. Second, with story sourcing, we are looking for vivid and specific descriptions of various situations of life within the community. These specifics, in turn, will be used to help create authentic, hyper-localized narratives as part of the behavior change media. Now, this piece can be particularly important when we're working with writers in the production process who are not from the specific region or area where the program is operating. And third, story scouts. Now, story scouts is the term we use for the people that conduct this kind of research, the story sourcing work, are really key to the entire process. The scouts artfully draw out compelling stories from people they are speaking with, much in the same way that a documentary filmmaker might do. And we contend that everyone has interesting stories that can be useful, but they're like treasures that need to be skillfully discovered. Typically for this work, we like to work with journalists, as they have the skill set to identify and draw out good stories from people. In the ideal scenario, we collaborate with local journalists who natively speak the predominant dialect and who are culturally familiar with the region. Now, in addition to this, to increase the likelihood of finding a variety of good stories, we like to assemble a group of journalists of different profiles who naturally have different approaches to the craft of drawing out stories. As an example of this kind of team approach, the project we've done in Kebbi State, which is in northern Nigeria, quite conservative, primarily Islamic region in northern Nigeria, we made sure to engage a female journalist who had been raised in the region to make sure that we captured stories from local women. We also engaged journalists who lived in the specific town we were working in to provide a native perspective and all the nuance that that entails. And we also wanted to work with a journalist who had covered kind of harder news stories across the Sahel region for decades for major global media outlets. These three scouts discovered 24 rich and detailed stories, kind of a fascinating cross-section from the community, which will help us contribute to effective behavior change programming around food safety. Now, I want to touch on 5 reasons why we feel that stories will contribute and how they have contributed, although there are certainly more than 5. And just by way of explanation, the reasons why we feel stories are effective are all interconnected, and they work as a whole. I'm simply disentangling them here to illustrate the point for this presentation. Let's see, to start with, it's human nature to see the world in story form. Stories are an important way we learn and communicate key information and ideas, not only from one generation to the next, think of myths or many religious stories, but also from day to day. I might say to my wife when I come home, you're never going to believe what happened at work today. Some anthropologists even suggest that this way of seeing the world in story form is a survival mechanism. We create or amplify stories to make sense of negative or positive happenings, to prevent or encourage certain behaviors related to those happenings in the future. To illustrate this idea, I'm going to share with you an example of one of the stories that came out of the story sourcing project that we did recently. In fact, I'm going to share a number of stories for the rest of this presentation. And I just want to point out that some of these stories touch on food and food safety very explicitly, but some don't. And that's completely fine, because what's important to us at this part of the process is to find stories that capture the imagination. When we build the media program, food safety messaging and behaviors will be fully embedded into the story. So to teach her son about the importance of kindness, Miss Aisha often tells him the story of how he was born. His father detested how the orphan boys would come begging for food early in the morning. He would shoo them away without a second thought. One day, Aisha went into labor and her husband, the boy's father, was away on work. She did not have any family close by or a phone to use. She started crying that her baby will die. All of a sudden, the orphan boys heard her cry and came to her rescue. These boys carried me like a baby and walked me more than a kilometer to the hospital. I would have lost you if not for them, she told her son. When the father returned, he rushed to the hospital full of joy and happiness that his son was born. When Aisha told her husband how she was able to reach the hospital, he cried for nearly a week, filled with regret about how he treated the orphan boys. Since that day, he vowed to always use the money he had to take care of them and to give them the help they needed to succeed in life. So through this simple and straightforward story, a true story at that, Aisha teaches her son about the importance of kindness by highlighting the negative and positive happenings around his birth. We learn in story form. Second, stories can trigger emotional and empathetic responses. Psychological research has suggested that in many instances, emotional responses can cause us to focus more and remember more. They also trigger empathy, which in turn can relax us and prime us to hear a message. Umar applied fertilizer in everything that the land needed for a successful harvest. He invested all his savings in the land and it looked perfect. He valued his 3 hectares into the hundreds of thousands of naira. It would be a good harvest in a good year. Then heavy rain came, much heavier than expected. The 3 hectares were completely submerged in water. The water stayed nearly 3 months. Everything was gone. We naturally feel empathy for this man. And whether or not we've ever lost everything in a flood, we intuitively understand the predicament he is in and feel for him. Third, in the field of narrative persuasion studies, a key mechanism that is often cited when understanding ways that stories work to persuade is called transportation. This is about being transported into the world of the story. We experience this when we watch a movie or TV show or read a good book. Quickly, we are transported into the world of the story, and once there, many of the rules that govern how we rationalize and structure our everyday experience can be put aside, if only for a few moments. Once transported, we are more open to hearing new messages and new ideas. Anything is possible or plausible in a story. Usman is a dedicated and skilled fisherman, committed to getting the biggest fish for his customers. To fulfill this commitment, he ventures into places nobody dares enter. He is a hustler, he's a daredevil, all to get an edge at the fish market. Until one day, wading in the water to find the best fish, he finds himself face to face with an alligator. The immediate transportation into this story signals that this is not going to be your standard food safety information. We want to know what happens to Usman, who will win this unexpected wrestling match. Now that we have been transported into the story, we are more likely to pay attention. So when food safety messaging, when food safety messaging around fish is woven into the tale, it's more likely to be heard. Fourth is character identification. Stories open paths to character identification, which is a key mechanism, again, often cited in persuasion studies. Here, character identification has more to do with the actions a character takes and less to do with the exterior attributes of that character. For example, I smoke and you smoke, or I am young and you are young. Rather, character identification has to do with what the character does related to what I also do, would do, or at least think I would do. A character, for example, puts down her life for her daughter. I feel I would also sacrifice myself for my daughter. Hence, I begin to identify with this character. She might be much younger than me and from a different culture entirely, but nonetheless, I now identify with her. Once we identify with a character, it's easy to see ourselves doing something they would do in the story. Ray and Natu recalled, "My cousin almost lost her baby because her doctor was a man and she was not comfortable with him and was always avoiding going to the hospital while she was pregnant. When Ray and Natu learned that her cousin and the baby nearly died as the baby was breached, she decided to become a doctor who would be like a warm blanket to other pregnant women in Kebbi. She comes from a poor home and her parents could not afford to enroll her in the school, so she ventured into the milk business. Her father owns some cows. She milks them and makes mocktails from the milk, which she sells at the market. When Ray and Natu was 11, she had finally earned enough money to pay her school fee. But by that time, she was the oldest in the class and got mocked because of it. I was laughed at and teased because of my age, but I knew my aim and why I was in school, so I did not let any of that bother me." Here, whether or not we are a young, ambitious Fulani girl, her dedication to not give up against all odds is a very identifiable action to many. It draws us to her, and we begin to see ourselves in her shoes and identify with actions she takes. Through this identification, we've primed an audience for behavioral messaging. Finally, stories themselves are fundamentally about change. At the beginning of a story, we find ourselves in an equilibrium within the world of that story, and then some kind of event disrupts it. This is often called the inciting incident. The story then shows how a character goes on a journey as a result of that inciting incident and then changes because of that journey. Farouk had a thriving business, but inadvertently began selling contaminated meat. The community began to get sick. He was blamed. His customers felt he betrayed their trust. His business was devastated. No one would shop there anymore. He had to quit that work and go home in shame. Here, we see the inciting incident for Farouk. What will happen? Will he be ruined? Will this be the start of a new life? Selling contaminated meat destroys his business. This in turn launches him on a journey somewhere new. This journey will change him. That change is the story, and it's the reason that we care. If you're curious what happened to Farouk, he decided to ask forgiveness for those that he made sick and made a commitment to keep his stall clean. Day by day, year by year, he slowly built it back and now has one of the cleanest stalls and was one of the most popular meat vendors in burning Kebbi's Central Market. The journey that Farouk takes leads to a new behavioral pattern that is a good illustration of how story can be an effective tool in templating behavior change. To summarize, the potential of a good story can't be underestimated. These stories are our data. Story sourcing helps us create social and behavior change media that goes beyond the topic of food safety to find local and relatable stories that can hook audiences into their imagination, capture their attention, and open them up to what is possible. Once the audience is hooked, then we begin to introduce ideas about safe food. With stories found by the Story Scouts, like the ones you just heard, program writers will have a lot of localized material to draw from in developing original stories, for finding, transporting narratives, and for creating identifiable characters, all to meet customers and vendors where they are. Thank you.
Thank you, Walker. Just before you stop, I hope you do plan to tell us what happened to Usman and the alligator.
Okay.
So our next step on our innovation journey brings us from understanding the problem and the stakeholders that we hope to engage with to designing innovative programs that engage consumers on food safety, especially those that shop in traditional markets. Angela Hansen is the founder of Food Systems Foresight. Angela has guided many teams advancing systems thinking in international development. She is a member of the World Economic Forum's Transformational Leaders Network and has led more than 100 strategic engagements in food systems. Please begin, Angela.
Thank you so much, Caroline. It's a pleasure to be here. So thanks for the time and thanks for the opportunity to follow Walker with his compelling stories. I'm going to tell you a story about Food Systems Foresight, and then I'm going to tell you a story about how we worked with EatSafe over the last year to bring some tools of human-centered design into the conversation around food safety, and really, as Walker talked about, meeting consumers where they are. So I'll move to the next slide just to begin with my own journey and my inciting incident, if you will. A few years ago, I was working as the Director of Agriculture and Food Security at a strategy consulting firm called Dahlberg, and I was also teaching at the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business, where I was introduced and started to really sink my fingers into concepts around systems thinking. Around this time, we were also starting to really see an illumination and increased understanding of the science behind climate change and the relationship between food systems and climate change. And this motivated me to start a new business, which is Food Systems Foresight, under the premise that our planet is facing its greatest challenge when we face climate change. And we believe that food plays a big role in fixing it. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how Food Systems Foresight works, and then we'll talk about how we worked with EatSafe. So we can move now to the next slide. Food Systems Foresight is a purpose-built consulting firm working in food systems transformation. Our mission is to arm food systems leaders with the lenses, tools, analysis, and insights that they need to make decisions about complex futures. We can move to the next slide. We use a few lenses when we engage with clients. The first is around systems. I mentioned systems thinking earlier as a pivotal realization in my own journey in food systems. Systems are complex in many cases, and when we talk about food systems, that's most certainly the case. When we want to understand systems, we look to understand their boundaries, and within those boundaries, we seek to understand their dynamics. Complexity is an issue to grapple with, whether we're working in informal markets in Nigeria or formal global food systems and trade systems and their regulation. Foresight is my next point. I'm back to the previous slide, thank you. Foresight is the second component or lens that we bring to our client service. Foresight allows us to see what is probable and also what is possible. Walker talked about priming through storytelling for what is probable and possible. Foresight is another way to do that. And strategy, finally, probably what we're all most familiar with when working with a strategy consulting firm, is designing a way of acting with intention to create specific impact. So at Food Systems Foresight, we bring these three lenses to the complex challenges facing food systems. We can move to the next slide. Thank you. In addition to the lenses, we work with a set of principles that I think are really important to the way we engage with partners like EatSafe and other partners like Pierce Mill, ILRI, and others on the webinar today. Our four principles are curiosity, collaboration, candor, and care. And I'd like to hover over care for just a minute as I think about what's going to be presented on our next slides, because I want to bring us back to a moment about a year ago. At this time, Bonnie, who opened our webinar, and I had been having a number of conversations about how EatSafe could move from about a year-long program of research, much of that research being quantitative, in many ways the way this webinar began, into a more qualitative phase of research, as well as a phase of intervention design. So Bonnie and I met several times over the course of the time preceding the 1 year ago. And we talked about the results of the research. We talked about what she was learning, what her teams were surfacing about food safety, especially in emerging markets and informal economies and informal food markets. And I'd like to move to the next slide to just show kind of where we were at. We were at that point of scratching our head and furrowing our brow. We were certainly at a point of managing so much information that was coming in from such a great deal of research threads. And in the effort to manage all of this information, we needed to take great care in ensuring that we were hearing the really hard science that was coming out about food safety, what was driving it, as well as some of the more softer elements, the qualitative elements, the story elements that Walker was speaking about. How could we move from all of the data that we were finding in the research into the next phase of EatSafe? Specifically, how could we move into driving, designing an intervention that might be useful and relevant and compelling in emerging markets and in informal food markets? So what we really needed to do, I've captured on the next slide, and that is we needed to move from a project space which was relatively concept-centered to a project space that is relatively human-centered. So the EatSafe team had been doing a great deal of research and generating frameworks and models that organize concepts and constructs. But what we knew was that humans take action to change systems. So how could we move into this human-centered design space to ensure that we would find adoption for any interventions that we developed, and that adoption would be by real people in the marketplace, and that we'd have real impact within the food systems we were targeting? So what I'll talk about for the next few slides is how at Food Systems Foresight, we joined the EatSafe effort for a period of 6, 8, 10, 12 months. And we're still around supporting this process of picking up a human-centered design toolkit to begin to design an intervention, specifically in Kebbi State, as Walker mentioned, in Nigeria, so that we might find a path to impact in informal food markets that was really grounded in meeting people where they are. So with all of that, we're saying we're proposing, or we began to see how EatSafe could use human-centered design. But I'd like to spend a minute to talk about what is human-centered design. And on the next slide, what I have is a definition here. And this definition I like very much because it grounds, I think, in the fundamentals. Human-centered design is fundamentally an affirmation of human dignity. And what we find in our work in international development, historically and oftentimes, is in an effort to be as precise and as accurate as possible, we ground our efforts in, and we found our foundation in data. But really, we need to have a wider frame around that data, and always remember that the work that we do is an attempt to advance human dignity. And I'm very drawn to the human-centered design toolkit for exactly this reason. It allows us as development practitioners to come into a space and begin from a point of departure that is foundational in human dignity. And the way we do that is very similar to some of the principles Walker talked about, because it's grounded in this concept of empathy. And that's one of the very first principles of human-centered design, probably the single most important element of human-centered design, is to begin with, anchor from, and use as one's point of departure as a designer, a deep wellspring of empathy for those we're designing for. So let's jump to the next slide and speak about some of the characteristics of human-centered design and how they help us in a context where we're seeking to solve problems and design solutions, especially in international development. So the first principle I've talked about is to be empathetic. Participants in a human-centered design process absolutely must buy into the idea that we start from being empathetic with those we're trying to design for. We won't be successful unless we can feel the feelings and understand the realities of the users of any particular intervention we're considering. Being empathetic is the very first characteristic of being a smart human-centered designer. This enhances our conventional problem solving. Many of us who come from schools of thought that are different may start a problem-solving process in a way that is more reductionist. I'm going to just pause for 1 second because I see I'm back with Caroline. Caroline, are we having some sort of technical challenge that I should be aware of, or are we all good?
No, you're all good. Go ahead. Thanks.
Okay, super. Thanks. So being empathetic really enhances this idea of conventional problem solving. And sometimes when we're solving problems in a conventional way, we can fault in a way that can be reductionist. We can break complexity down into small discrete pieces and solve at that small discrete level, feeling that sense of success and closure when we fix all of the little boxes. But what we really need to remember is that we're solving for humans, and humans are complex. And that's how our empathy keeps us in line in a human-centered design process, always remembering that we're solving for humans, not strictly for logical solutions. How will a human react to this provocation, this intervention? Keeping empathy at the forefront is a great way to ensure human-centered design as an approach can be successful. Another characteristic of a great human-centered designer is that they approach the process in a collaborative way. And we really saw this on the EatSafe engagement, because we brought folks from all across the EatSafe partnership into a really intense process of human-centered design, because we knew that all of those folks had a broad set of abilities, and we wanted to use those abilities to bring to bear our smartest solutions and our most empathetic approaches. The next point I'll bring up is that human-centered designers who are successful are optimistic. I mentioned food systems Foresight's, some of our core principles, and one of them is curiosity. I said, how might we test old assumptions when I thought about curiosity? How might we do better? And that is a foundationally optimistic perspective to bring to the process of intervention design. And it's a characteristic of a really powerful human-centered designer. It builds on patterns when we're optimistic. When we see what worked in the past, when we recognize what is and appreciate it, the good appreciates. So building on patterns and positive intuition is an important part of human-centered design. And finally, one of the most important characteristics of being a powerful human-centered designer is a willingness to be experimental. And for many of us who have spent a long time in an academic world, in a research environment, in a proof environment, we want to be really sure our experiment is well designed and set up. And so we have a comfort with that degree of experimentality. But in human-centered design, often we don't have the time, the perfect conditions to architect the most ideal experiment. And we rather just have to get out there and test, move quickly, operate within a low fidelity environment. And so being experimental, being gritty, being low fidelity and ready to roll out there in the real world, getting real feedback as soon as possible, is a very important characteristic of a powerful designer. And in this way, we allow ourselves to be inspired by the behavior that we're seeing, the way people really react to what we're putting in front of them, rather than the demographics that we believe to be true about a population in general that we're designing for. So that characteristic of really being factual, tactical, practical, tactile, getting inspired by human behavior and getting in there to really test assumptions as quickly as possible for some of the foundations of human-centered design. Now, this is a process, can take many, many shapes and forms. I've been involved in dozens and dozens of human-centered design activities, and each and every one of them has a different duration, a different shape, a different tone, a different texture. With EatSafe, what we chose to do, because we had a myriad constraints and considerations in terms of timing, in terms of the global pandemic, in terms of location of experts, we chose to deliver our human-centered design process through an approach called a sprint. And I'm going to talk you through the sprint process just on our next slide here, which is a process designed to be rapid. We're designed to move from Monday through Friday, from the point of having a design challenge to the point where we can learn from the actual application of an intervention to a real life human population. So that is an incredibly rapid journey. I know that the participants of the EatSafe sprint that we ran in August of this past year felt like we were on warp speed from beginning to end through that process. But we were really fortunate to have a well-tested process in the sprint process, which we leveraged from Google Ventures and customized for our unique context and environment in Kebbi State. So really this process served us in being rapid and being well-tested. So we could really quickly deploy a human-centered design intervention, as a starting point to move from the research to the design phases of EatSafe. So with that, I will conclude my remarks and look forward to questions on this and engagement in the panel.
Thank you, Angela. Our final step is to look at the method to move from creation and ideation to ensuring that the proposed solutions can work in practice. To guide us here, two speakers from the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics will share the floor. Pratika Mohan is a behavioral design specialist with a degree from the Rhode Island School of Design and tons of experience, including work involving culturally informed designs for many countries. Iya Evang is a senior associate at Busara who says she is particularly passionate about testing programs before they are rolled out. Please begin, Pratika.
Thanks, Caroline. So before we dive in, I just want to give everyone an overview of Busara and our approach to how we do our work and how this informed the work that we did with EatSafe. So Busara combines evidence-based and context-specific solutions to address specific problems. What that means, next slide, is that behavioral science is an analytical approach that uses contextual research to explain how people make decisions. While we may feel we have clear intentions, our actions do not always reflect that. Establishing motivation and intent is a critical first step in order to studying habits, goals, and identity is crucial to a real understanding of the reasons behind why choices we make. Next slide. Our minds are far less independent than we would like it to believe. Through behavioral science, we aim to generate legitimate objective conclusions on human behavior and understand the effect of our individual contexts that have on our decisions. So factors that affect our decision-making include next slide, environment, next one, motivation, memory, and peers. Next slide. So behavioral design is the systemic approach that relies on scientific insights and evidence to create interventions capable of positive behavior influence and change. It's a process of integrating human perspective in all steps of problem-solving process, aiming to better understand an issue from a human perspective and focusing on how it looks and feels to users and stakeholders within that environment and context. To meet people where they are is not sufficient to simply understand people on their own terms. We have to actually dig further to understand how human cognition and social context shapes people's decisions and behaviors, often in ways in which they're not aware of. This is where behavioral design combines behavioral science with human-centered design to add rigor, tests through behavioral informed surveys, and improves measurability. Next slide. And Angela previously spoke about the human-centered design process, so I won't go too further into it, but it's basically an iterative design process that allows us to design solutions keeping the user at the center of our solutions and ensuring that we have empathy throughout our process. For our approach for EatSafe and to design interventions, we use the 3 steps in order to come up with concepts with a consortium of different partners and stakeholders to ensure that we were actually consumer facing and making sure that our interventions were behaviorally informed. We started with ideation, where we sort of came up with design sprint sessions to come up with low fidelity ideas. Then we went into intervention refinement, where we got a group of individuals together to sort of refine key areas of interventions to ensure that we were aligned on objective, what kind of behavioral mechanisms were being included, what parameters for the interventions were being considered. And then Basara went ahead, refined these, and developed concepts that will take forward, that are taken forward for testing. I'm going to walk us through a few examples of what this looks like. Next slide. Next slide. So for our intervention design, we had a group of people come together, as mentioned. These were how we sort of put ideas together. So for the first, we looked at objectives. So how does the intervention actually measure and change perceptions? What are the outputs? So how are we looking to measure the intervention? The detail regarding the intervention and how it's supposed to be built out, parameters. So how does the intervention take place and how it can be delivered, and behavioral mechanisms. So these are key behavioral principles that are applied to the interventions and concepts that are taking forward to testing, which to really ensure we're able to change perception. So an example of this is how we did it was through Mural. So we used, since we're all in different parts of the world, we use Mural to ensure that we're able to capture everyone's ideas and solutions, and making sure that all voices were being able to be heard, and also creates that creativity of being doing in-person brainstorm sessions. So for this, we have the first example I'm going to walk us through is the radio intervention. So as you can see from those sessions, this is like an example of a refined concept and what it looks like. So an objective for a radio campaign that was finalized and came up with was consumers able to understand and value the importance of food safety in order to inform purchasing decisions. As you can see, there were a number of key outputs, which we want to ensure that we're able to measure the campaign. Then we have specifics around the intervention idea itself. Then we go into parameters. So there are 6 key parameters for this specific intervention and how it's supposed to work within the environment, and the behavioral mechanisms. So here we're really looking to understand like what sort of behavior change we're looking to address within a specific intervention. So for example, for radio, we were looking at descriptive social norms, social desirability, and aspirations. So when developing concepts and solutions, these were key mechanisms that were applied to the concepts to ensure they work within the parameters. Another example is a brand, so a food safety brand. So here we're looking at how we can create a brand that consumers and vendors feel like they really resonate with the brand, and it also signals to them that everyone's making an effort and that it's something that the community is working towards in order for long-term sustainability. So for that, we came up with parameters on like what the brand actually values, how the brand is supposed to work. So like what kind of tone, how is it presented to consumers and vendors? How do they actually view it? And again, behavioral mechanisms that are attached to the brand to ensure that we're able to deliver and keep concepts that keep all this in mind. So a few examples of what these concepts look like are, next slide. So here's examples where we created a stand, where we created brand language, we created a storyboard in order to really, really refine the concepts, but also just to understand what consumers and vendors' perceptions are. And all of the concepts have the key behavioral mechanisms attached to it, which we'll be testing against. Another example of this is a poster design, which uses like descriptive norm messaging and like sort of applies to aspirations or creates that competitive element. The next example includes, next slide, is like an example of signaling to vendors and consumers that this is a safe food market. So when they feel that everyone around them is practicing in something that's similar, when everyone around them is practicing something, they're also willing to practice it more. So going to that in-group bias. Another example is through different brand messagings and campaigns. So either a customer feedback form, a certificate for vendors, or a training manual. So all of these were designed keeping our users in mind, but also really thinking about like what kind of behaviors we're looking to change and how we can change those perceptions through concept design. I'm going to hand it over to Aya, who will speak more about our surveying techniques.
Yeah, thank you, Prithika, and hi everyone. So I want to talk about the other side of Busara's approach to behaviorally designed interventions, which is testing. So for us, we think of testing as a phased approach. We start with pre-testing, which is more of a qualitative approach to understand how the target audience feel about an intervention and its elements. So here we get their thoughts and inputs, and that helps us to sense check and avoid, for instance, doing anything contextually appropriate or inappropriate, or other mistakes. The next round of testing is then A/B tests. And now we basically have an idea of the intervention we want to do, but we're still unsure of how to choose certain elements. And we want to make these decisions based on which factors provides the best chance for behavior change in the direction we're aiming for. And this basically helps us to put the best version of the intervention together as possible. So once we have the best possible version of the intervention, we can then roll it out. And I'm sure you're all familiar with more long-term monitoring and evaluation, which we consider to be the last phase of the testing. So in these remaining minutes that I have, I want to focus on the A/B testing. So we can go to the next, thanks. So the reason we use A/B tests is because we want actual behavioral outcomes, what we sometimes refer to as revealed preferences. So the philosophy is basically that self-reported questions often simply tells us the intention someone may have to do something. So to give an example, when we're thinking about this campaign around food safety, imagine we want to assess which elements work best in the campaign. So to measure which elements work best at, for instance, increasing perceived level of importance and interest as well, we could randomly assign people to see different versions of the campaign and afterwards ask them, how important is food safety to you? Or we could offer them to sign up to some sort of program to receive more information. And it's a very simple thing, but signing up to receive more information is an action that you have no reason to take unless you genuinely want more information and is interested. So we can use that as a proxy for perceived importance, right? Whereas it's likely that most people will respond that food safety is important, no matter which intervention we present. So it's just a very simplified example, but say you want to understand which intervention design is best and leads to increased interest for food safety, we'd prefer to use the latter type of measurement because we prioritize actions over intentions. So once we've thought through what it is we're trying to achieve with our intervention, whether it's increased interest or maybe improved knowledge or something else, we want to break down our intervention into all those choices that are going into the design process. So those are the elements you're seeing on this slide. So for instance, product features, processes, communications, customer engagement, and so on. All of this can be tested using A/B tests. So to give another example, based on what Prithika was just talking about with the radio campaign, so that would go under the communications and customer engagement, right? So maybe what we would want to find out there is understanding who should be the messenger on the radio show, for instance. That could be gender, it could be age, it could be, you know, whether it's an authoritative figure, whether it's someone from the community, what tone they should speak in, how things should be framed, a lot of other elements that we may sit and discuss as the project's team, but where it might actually be better to just test out the different things. And in this case, we mean not pre-test, not ask people what they would prefer, but actually see which of these different messages leads to the actions that it is we want to drive. So for instance, say we want to assess which exact intervention design leads to the best knowledge retention. We can set up a study where people are randomly assigned to different variations of this intervention. So for instance, different messengers. We then present them with a quiz at the very end, and we see which type of intervention messenger helps people best remember the information. So that would, for instance, constitute as a simple A/B test, right? You're looking at different variants of an intervention, and you think through actual behavioral outcome measures at the end, which tells you something about actions, and it's not something that is self-reported in the sense that people are just mentioning their intentions. So next one, please. So practically, when we do A/B tests or experiments in general at Busara, we use our behavioral labs. So this one is a photo from the one we have in Nairobi. And we're actually currently in the process of setting one up with ABU University in Nigeria as well. But yeah, the key features of these are that people are sitting individually. They can't see each other's screens, and it's a controlled environment where we can clearly say that if a majority of participants respond differently to one type of intervention than another, then this provides us pretty clean evidence that that type of intervention has better potential than the other. So the key thing here is that there can't be spillover effects. They can't talk to each other. So basically you're seeing one thing and you're then responding to the outcome measures that we have previously designed, which are then in line with the outcomes that we're of course aiming to drive with the intervention. So one last thing to mention on these types of studies is that the behavioral outcome measures are typically when you boil down what it is you want to achieve to a certain behavioral mechanism. So the interest one is, for instance, signing up to something is a proxy for interest, is a proxy for, do you believe that this information is valuable? So that's kind of what we're trying to think through, and then assessing these different variations of the interventions, which one of them drives it in the direction we're aiming to go. So yeah, it can typically take place in a place similar to this. It can also be much less formal. The most important thing is just that people are not interrupting each other, and that we can make sure that, for instance, participant 1 doesn't see what's on participant 2's screen and so on, right? So yeah, these decision labs, as we also call them, they're a very unique feature of Busara's work. And we're really excited to see how we can bring the elements from them into the EatSafe work. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aya. All right, we have a few questions and a little bit of time to do our question and answer. So Walker, I warned you, our first question is for you. And while you're answering this, could you please also tell us what happened to the fisherman and the alligator? Because I'm so curious. But the question is, are there any examples where storytelling was used to influence government policy or other high-level strategies?
Sure. Let's see. Well, first, I'll just tell you that he wrestled the alligator and he won. He got bruised up, but he used it as a point of pride that no one's going to get better fish than he. So in terms of policymaker, that question, let's see. I mean, I think you see stories used a lot in advocacy ads and PR and marketing campaigns that are attempting to influence the public or other stakeholders who in turn influence policymakers. I think that's where you see it the most clear example of it. In kind of regular everyday life. Of course, you see stories used at high-level speeches and addresses to try to open up emotional connection with the audiences. And then any kind of story-based program in, say, for a traditional market, officials as consumers can also be exposed to those programs. So I guess I think the principles behind storytelling as a tool for behavior change are pretty universal and can be deployed in many different strategic ways. So I think that I don't have a specific example to give you, but I think that there's a lot of examples of it being used both directly and indirectly in different ways.
Thank you, Walker. I actually have a number of specific examples in passing a law in the United States on food safety, the Food Safety Modernization Act. We use stories extensively. We use families, and the families came to us and said, please tell our story about an adverse event from food. Often they had lost children. Or children had died following exposure, and they would come to us and say, please, we don't want this to happen to other people. So stories have been used extensively in advocacy. Okay, I have a couple of questions actually for Aya and Pratika. So first, from Brian Bedard, the first question that we just answered was from Anouk DeVries. Brian Bedard asked, concepts presented incorporate the fundamental elements of food safety culture and behavior change. Can you discuss the work being done to develop the approaches or tools to assess food safety culture maturity in informal markets? Over to you, Aya.
Okay.
I think, yeah, maybe.
Yeah, do you want to go first, Pratika? I'm not sure this is directly related to what I was talking about.
Yeah, I think so. When we were designing concepts and when we're keeping our work in mind, one of the things, and typically what you do is through surveying, and this will also come during our testing, we'll ensure that we have a base level understanding of how people view food safety. Is that something that's actually important to their goals? What does that actually mean to them? While some of these concepts not all concepts are being shown here, but some of them do keep this sort of understanding in mind. So we want to tease out through these concepts, what's their understanding? Do these concepts actually have the ability to change perceptions? And then another thing that we've done in order to ensure that they're culturally sensitive as well is that we've included people and who are within the state, who understand the context of the situation well, in order to ensure that the concepts, when we go into it, we're confident with how they're going to be received by people on the ground. And then also, it also helps us have a level of discussion that comes with this testing. So I think when Aya talked about A/B testing and going forward, the questions also assess their perceptions, their attitudes, or just even their what their base level understanding of some of these ideas are.
Thank you. That's a challenging question and kind of at the heart of EatSafe. We are now at time, and so I would like to turn it over to Bonnie McClafferty to give some closing remarks, observations from our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, and we are right at time. So I will be brief. First of all, I'd like to thank all the presenters. Sarah, the importance in really laying the stage for perception and risk, and for me, the underlying need to build on this resource. Thank you for setting the stage and recognizing, quote, the people's voice. It's a great introduction to the session. Walker, power of the story. You're so impressive, and I'm convinced, from going from hyper global to now hyper local and relatable, these vivid descriptions of life and capturing the imagination of consumers. These stories are truly the treasures for changing behavior. So thank you for bringing that. Angela, photo aside, you are a champion. You are an amazing, very very bold thinker. Food System Foresights brings these lenses and tools and insights, and thank you for guiding and leading us to the human-centered design path to have impact in this particular context. Let's remember, we did this during a pandemic across continents and time zones, virtually, being hyper-global and hyper-local at the same time. You worked magic with the entire EatSafe team. Prithika and Aya, evidence-based and context to address problems, explaining how people make these decisions, understanding why it's important and the reasons behind choices. Thank you for describing the process and what is now a process to validate these ideas that we worked with under EatSafe for the concepts. But to all of the audience, I did want to close with the second reason. You'll recall that there were two reasons I was interested in this webinar in particular. First was for the rich content. The second is that this webinar is very special to me, in that over the 35 past years I've been working at this nexus of nutrition and agriculture, food safety is the obvious capstone. For those who don't know, I will be retiring from GAIN at the end of February. Yes, retiring. It's wonderful to know that great progress has been made to one of humanity's greatest challenge, that being nutrition. Progress in agriculture, progress in nutrition. We now have set a stage for progress in the safety of foods as part of the food systems transformation agenda. We cannot go forward without putting food safety right there. Because if foods are unsafe, no matter how nutritious, they cannot nourish. I have been blessed to be surrounded by dedicated and brilliant people tackling the world's most challenging problem. And many of you who've attended this event, I simply want to say thank you, thank you. Going forward, please eat safe and be safe. Please join for future webinars by GAIN. Thank you.